Hi, my name is Marina and I'm an aspiring barrister. I moved to England 3 years ago, and in continuation of my studies I pursued a law course which paved the way to the English legal bar. Last year I applied for a scholarship at one of the Inns of Court, but other candidates have demonstrated a stronger claim over the available funds. So this year I'm looking to reapply at the same inn and for the same purpose. My interest in law was sparked some 6 years ago by a former judge I used to work for back in my home country. He was among the few who encouraged me to think of myself as someone who is good with words, storytelling, and writing, basically the literary side of the things, and not to dismiss this set of abilities as insignificant. Sadly, he's no longer among us, but his legacy, namely that of continuous development through education, is so alive within me that I wish to bring a tribute to him. He was a prolific reader, and he instilled in me the thought that a criminal case can teach us a great deal about the human nature, about the social and political attitudes of a time, the change that it might bring in law, and so on and so forth. I also seek to encourage others to take up more reading in this field and not to dismiss law as a topic strictly reserved for practitioners. Law is fascinating. So it is really in this context that I thought of recording a weekly episode, part of a series concentrating on the details, ins and outs, implications and controversies of some notorious criminal cases. The information is gathered and synthesized from two exceptional books written by Thomas Grant QC, a Queen's Counsel whose manner of writing is widely readable and who is very capable of explaining complex matters in a simple but eloquent way. So without further introduction to this first video, I thought I should challenge you all to think about a criminal case. Just try to have a mental picture of a criminal case. Do you imagine the thoughtful defendant in the dock? The randomly selected jury in their seats? The bewigged counsel? Do you also see other characters in this trial? The use of characters is not accidental, because if you think about it, a criminal case can very much acquire the characteristics of a novel or a play, a story. And this is what I intend to bring to you, a true story. So sit back, relax, and let me take you back in time. 1907, more specifically, and to the trial of Robert Wood. This criminal case was the first of a significant relevance tried in the newly built Court Number 1 of the Old Bailey. But first, the facts. Emily Dimmock was found dead in her bedroom 113 years ago this exact day, which is 12th of September 1907. She was married to Bert Shaw, and they both lived as lodgers at 29 St. Paul's Road. To her landlords, Emily lied about being a dressmaker, but in reality, she led a double immoral life. Under the nom de guerre Phyllis, she was a part-time butterfly of the streets who frequented a pub from Camden namely the rising sun. This is where she met Robert Wood. Robert was an artistic designer. To his friends, family, colleagues, he was known as a gentle and good-natured man. Yet, beneath the veneer of respectability that he was very careful to maintain, some form of nostalgia drew him in the evenings to the dives of the rising sun. On the evening of 6th of September 1907, Emily approached Robert at the rising sun and casually asked him for a drink. At the same time, a young boy happened to enter the bar selling postcards. Emily told Robert that she wanted to buy one. At that time, Emily was taken up by the worldwide craze and was a collector, postcard collector. Robert dismissed the cards on sale as inartistic and took out of his pocket a card of his own where he drew a rising sun and noted, "Phyllis darling, if it pleases you to meet me at 8:15 at the rising sun, yours to a cinder, Alice." Emily had apparently cautioned Robert against using his real name. Robert later put the postcard into a letter and it reached Emily swiftly. They met as scheduled in the postcard and were seen leaving the rising sun together but returning after a couple of hours, enough time for a visit at St. Paul's Road. At around midnight, Robert Wood left Emily in the company of another man, Robert Roberts. This is where it gets a little confusing since both men have the same name. Emily and Roberts, the second man, spent the following days in each other's company, while Roberts was still in Emily's room on the morning of 11th of September. A lodger pushed some letters from her admirers under the door. One of the letters was from Robert Wood, asking to meet Emily at the Eagle that evening, meaning 11th of September. The Eagle being a pub Emily rarely frequented. For some reason, Emily showed Roberts the letter and the postcard, which were both received from Robert Wood. In the day before her death, it was reported by her landlady that Emily washed and ironed all day. In the evening, Emily went out to the Eagle with her hair still in curling pins. A friend of Robert Wood called by chance at the Eagle and saw both Emily and Robert in each other's company. This was the last time Emily was seen alive. In the late morning of 12th of September, Emily's mother-in-law arrived at 29 St. Paul's Road to visit the young couple. The landlady told her that Emily was still in bed, so they both waited quietly. In the meantime, Bert arrived home from his night shift and found the room to their door locked. He was shocked to discover the lodging in a complete mess. All the drawers have been pulled out from their chest, and Emily's collected postcards were on the floor as if there had been a frenzied search for something. Bert found Emily in a pool of blood, face down on the bed with the curling pins in her hair. There was bloody water in the basin, empty bottles and dining plates, suggesting perhaps that Emily may have dined with someone she knew the night before. Her gold jewelry remained untouched, which ruled out a murder for robbery. The coroner also ruled out suicide. His opinion was that Emily Dimmock had been murdered by a swift cut from a sharp blade administered to her while asleep. Emily's double life was swiftly uncovered by the police investigation. Dozens of her clients and colleagues were interviewed, but no major breakthrough until one day at the end of September, when Bert cleared out the lodging he shared with Emily. This is when he discovered the postcard that Wood has sent Emily in the days before her death. He gave the postcard to the police, who in turn reproduced it in several newspapers under the headline, "Who wrote this postcard?" The first one to recognize the handwriting was Ruby Young. She and Robert Wood have been sweethearts in the past. He confessed writing the postcard, but asked her to provide a false alibi for him for the 11th of September, which is the day they met at the Eagle. However, Ruby was riddled with her own anxiety at her complicity in Wood's falsehood, and she confided in a friend. That friend spoke to a reporter, who in turn went to the police. Shortly after, Robert Wood was arrested and charged on the coroner's inquisition with the willful murder of Emily Dimmock, a charge to which he confidently pleaded not guilty. He was refused bail and awaited trial at the Old Bailey. Wood's arrest attracted mass hysteria and an incredible amount of press interest. Morbid sightseers visited the Rising Sun. Newspapers published uncensored pictures of Emily's body, and Wood's employers, convinced of the innocence of their gentle designer, have added a significant sum to Robert Wood's defense fund. It was the respectable Edward Marshall Hall, King's Counsel, who defended Robert Wood. Hall was a dominant and imposing legal personality of the time who took silk at the tender age of 39. He was known as the Great Defender, who would courageously stand up for the poor and save the blameless men and women from the gallows. In an age that lionized barristers, Marshall's style of advocacy was very different from that of more conventional barristers of the time. While the courtroom technique of more conventional barristers was that of an interested observer, aloof and apart from the tragedy, Marshall Hall identified himself with the central figure of the case, as if his thoughts, actions, and impulses were his own. Become one of them. Get into the juror box with them. Make yourself the 13th juror. This is the strategy he adopted when defending. For the prosecution, we had Sir Charles Matthews, a more conventional barrister. On the trial's first day, the public gallery was populated with journalists, theatrical personalities, and writers. A common feature of the trials at the beginning of the last century was the presence of writers and actors intently observing the proceedings. It was believed that a trial can provide tantalizing insights into the human condition. Where else could one study so minutely the extremes of human character than in the dock? In every criminal trial, it is the prosecution who makes the opening speech. It is important to mention that Wood admitted to the police that he was the author of the postcard, but he vehemently denied that he was anywhere around Emily in the days before her death. He was also unaware that Ruby Young broke her covenant with him. The prosecutor started by emphasizing some strong points to the all-man jury. Back in the 1900s, women were not allowed to be part of a jury. So first, he put it to them that Wood, had known Emily for much longer than he admitted. And if a longer association could be proved, it could be very damaging for the defense. Secondly, he stressed that Wood attempted to persuade Ruby into a false alibi. Thirdly, the prosecutor drew jury's attention to Wood's postcard and the letter and the fact that the writing on both is identical. Then he came to the fatal night. He suggested that when Emily left home on the Wednesday evening, which is the night before her death, she was going to meet Wood at a place where she was not well known. He also placed significance on the fact that she still had her curlers in her hair, which could mean that she was going to meet someone she knew well. Finally, Matthews reminded the jury of the state of the room, namely all cards on the floor, as if the murderer looked for a particular card which might be there. Up to this point, I believe we can all agree that there is a very strong evidential case for the prosecution. But in every criminal trial, it's not actually the evidence who secures the conviction. What is decisive is whether the prosecution can prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. This is a very high legal standard of proof. If the prosecution cannot prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, the case must be dropped and the defendant acquitted, irrespective of how overwhelming the evidence against him is. After the prosecution puts its case, it calls on witnesses which will be cross-examined by the defense. This is called cross-examination. During it, a total of 35 witnesses gave their version of events and were questioned by Edward Marshall Hall. His imperious demeanor was known to terrorize witnesses even before the questioning started. By far, the most important witness for the prosecution was Ruby Young, who betrayed the man she still loved while in the dock testifying against him. Together with other two witnesses, she identified Wood as someone broad-shouldered with a peculiar jerk walk who left 29 St. Paul's Road on the morning of Emily's death. If the evidence was believed, it placed Wood at the scene of the crime at the time of its commission. But the use of peculiar jerk of shoulders was swiftly challenged by Marshall Hall in an outrage. Asking his client to stand up in the dock, Hall addressed the witness twice. "I ask you again, as an honest person, where a man's life may be hanging on your words and description, would you describe this man as a broad-shouldered man?" This is clearly an intimidating question. Bert Shaw, Emily's husband, also sat in the dock for cross-examination. Marshall Hall insinuated that Shaw might have committed the crime. This was an absurd presumption, but a very clever one because it planted doubt into the juror's mind. The landlady had her 5 minutes in the spotlight, but she was rather economical with details. She maintained all throughout that she went to bed early and therefore saw nothing. But can we really believe that Emily was able to receive her clients and let them out in the morning without her landlady living immediately below knowing? That's questionable. A vital witness for the prosecution was Robert Roberts. Just to remind you, he was the second man that Emily spent time with. He presented real difficulty for Robert Wood, since he claimed to have seen the letter being pushed under her door. the letter in which Robert Wood was asking to meet Emily at the Eagle in the night before her death. Once again, Marshall Hall sought to put doubt into the juror's mind by slightly suggesting that Roberts might have at least been in Camden neighborhood the evening of Emily's death, which could make him a suspect of murder. Enough doubt for jurors so that they don't convict Robert Wood? We will very soon see. Robert Wood's employer also sat in the dock for cross-examination, and this gave Hall the opportunity to milk the affections Wood's employer had for this good-natured and gentle designer. Did he ever notice anything peculiar about Wood's walk? No. Was he an amiable man and kind to animals? Yes. Could such an animal lover be capable of such a cold-hearted crime? Of course not. The pendulum continued to swing back and forth. The prosecution also brought a number of Emily's work colleagues who testified on Emily's long-term connection with her client, Robert Wood. The testimonies were very damaging for the defense, but once again, Marshall Hall, had managed to discredit their account by emphasizing the bad character and the low class of society they belonged to. In yet another trick, Hall victimized his client by insinuating that the witness for the prosecution has something against his client. This tactic was again for the benefit of the jury, who would at least question how truthful these butterfly of the streets might be. When the prosecution case was over, spontaneous applause broke out from the gallery. In the public's mind, the tide was turning in favor of Robert Wood. Now it was for the defense to put their case. Marshall Hall began calling his witnesses. This is known as examination in chief. The first witness for defense was Wood's father, who elaborated a story according to which his son was at home the night of Emily's murder and was seen in the neighborhood of his home the morning after, in a cheery and composed manner. Next into the dock was Robert Wood himself. The Criminal Evidence Act of 1898 did not oblige the defendants to enter the witness box. If they did, however, decide to exercise this right, they risked self-incriminating themselves, in other words, answering questions in a manner that might be very damaging for their defense. Conversely, if the defendant did not enter the dock as a witness, the judge might draw adverse inferences, while the jury might come to the conclusion that the defendant is seeking to hide his guilt. Despite knowing that almost every defendant who put themselves forward as a witness in a murder case at the Old Bailey had been found guilty, Marshall Hall insisted that Robert Wood should seize the chance to tell his story to the jury. Procedurally, if this right is exercised, the defendant must enter the dock first, but Marshall Hall defied this precedent and placed Wood in the dock last of all his witnesses. The first question that Marshall Hall asked Robert was straight to the point. Did you kill Emily Dimmock? Simple and straightforward. For several agonizing moments, Wood said nothing at all. Then he furiously replied, "This is ridiculous." All throughout the examination in chief, Wood sought to dissociate himself from Emily and the disgraceful life she led. He also changed his account to now admitting he had seen Emily by chance on the fatal night, but that he left her at around 11 p.m. On the last day of the trial, the prosecutor cross-examined Robert Wood. He was floundering and he was struggling with the details. At some point in the course of questioning, he even said he doesn't know the name of the pub, which is the Eagle, only to admit at a later stage that he went there with Emily the days before her death. When asked whether he had sexual intercourse with Emily, he once again reminded the court in protest that he does not associate himself with low characters. This was a display of pure hypocrisy and snobism, since he and Ruby were sweethearts in the past and he knew her to be a prostitute herself. All his show and the ludicrous atmosphere that his advocate managed to create seemed to have benefited him in the end. Immediately after Wood left the witness box, Marshall Hall stood up to make his final submission to the jury. Firstly, he emphasized the absence of a motive, and then he pointed out to the timing. It was presumed that Emily was killed in the early hours of 12 of September 1907. Robert Wood, backed by his father and friends, concocted an alibi for both the evening before and the morning after the murder. Then Robert Hall came to the conclusion, and this is something that I will read. It's an extract from the book, and I'd like to read it out loud. So that's why if I don't make any eye contact, you'll know why. If you are satisfied beyond all reasonable doubt that a man standing here on the night of 11th of September murdered Emily Dimmock, although it breaks your heart to do so, find him guilty and send him to the scaffold. But if under the guidance of a greater power than any earthly power, making up your own mind for yourselves on the evidence, if you feel you cannot honestly and conscientiously say you are satisfied with that the prosecution have proved this man to be guilty, if after giving effect to everything said by the counsel for the prosecution and by the learned judge, you feel on the evidence laid before you that you could not honestly and conscientiously say beyond all reasonable doubt that the prosecution have proved their case, then I say it will be your duty as well as your pleasure to say, as you are bound to say, that Robert Wood is not guilty of Emily Dimmock's murder. Marshall Hall was indeed a gifted orator with a rich vernacular. The prosecution's closing speech was deemed to be very short and inarticulate. Addressing the jury for one last time before a verdict was reached, the judge had unreservedly stated that this had been the most remarkable trial in his time. He sided with the defense team by stating that he doesn't think that the prosecution has brought the case home near enough to the accused. Thunderous applause ensued in court number 1. At the 11th hour, the judge was virtually directing the jury towards an acquittal. The jury retired at 8 p.m. Nowadays, a court would adjourn sometime after 4 p.m. But then, once the evidence was over, judges were impatient to obtain a verdict, even if that meant sitting into the night. In the anxious minutes before the jury's return, Robert Wood passed his time sketching, even drawing a portrait of the judge, titling it The Last Moment. Such extraordinary composure mesmerized the gathered journalists. The trial itself had been a national sensation covered by every newspaper in the country. A vast crowd of no less than 10,000 onlookers started to gather at the Old Bailey, awaiting the verdict. Such a response to a trial is now inconceivable, but in an age where TV and cinema and radio were still in their infancy, the criminal courts provided very much of national entertainment. After just an astonishing 17 minutes of deliberation, the jury unanimously found Robert Wood not guilty of Emily Dimmock's murder. There was uproar in the court, and the crowd outside the Old Bailey reacted with cheers and singing as the news of Wood's acquittal spread among them. Across London, shows were stopped mid-performance for the verdict to be announced, and the nation was developed in a state of collective joy. It is very difficult now to understand the national sympathy for Wood, as the crime for which he was charged was heinous and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The witnesses who testified against Wood were threatened, stigmatized, and abused, and one described his experience in the dock as harrowing, and I quote, "In future, even if I actually saw with my own eyes a man getting his throat cut in the street, I do not think I would give evidence again." Above all else, the trial had been a triumph for Edward Marshall Hall. He became the undisputed star of the English bar, a position he maintained until his death. After the verdict, Hall told reporters that he was convinced of Wood's innocence, but some years later it was reported that he confided into his daughter that in all probability Robert Wood was guilty. This is also the conclusion that most writers have also arrived at. The trial became a game that Marshall won, not because the facts turned out the way they did, but because Robert Wood was lucky enough to have Marshall Hall as his advocate in all his glorious ability to create suspense in the courtroom. The case has since exercised a powerful influence on artists, theatrical performances, and authors of the time. One such artist was Walter Sickert, who started a series of paintings in which the central figure was a naked woman, her face obscured, lying in a dreary Londonese room. Later on, he introduced a male figure standing by the woman. The body of paintings is known, the Camden Town Murders, and it's very difficult to be read in artistic terms, but one could make that Emily is artistically expressed as an anonymous, faceless woman, vulnerable to a mysterious male presence. The case also spawned several novels of the 1930s and 1940s, and one of them is For Them That Trespass by Ernest Raymond, and even a Royal Opera House ballet. Through the decades, the central image of a young woman, beautiful, naked and dead, the victim of male desire and male violence, has exerted a great influence over the English culture. Seeing how a criminal case can permeate so many levels of our society, it therefore becomes imperative to understand where a certain mentality stems from and how it developed into what it is today. Knowing the past can help us understand the present, and can also to a certain degree help us predict the future mentalities, the future attitudes, and so on. Thank you very, very much for your time, and see you next week for another fascinating trial which shaped today's society. Goodbye.